They rang the bell 41 times before they dragged her into the square, one for every year the kingdom had stood without a single witch burned inside its walls. Elenna Duskmere counted every toll from inside her cell, because counting was the only thing keeping her hands from shaking. She had healed the Queen Mother's cough with chamomile and honeyroot, she had held the woman's hand through 3 fevers, and now she was going to die for poisoning her. The crowd did not know her name anymore. To them she was only the witch, a shape to throw stones at, a story that let them sleep easier believing evil had a face, and that face was a 19-year-old apothecary's apprentice with ash-blonde hair and trembling knees. Somewhere in that crowd stood the prince who once called her his dearest friend, and he did not meet her eyes. The executioner lit the torch. The wood beneath her feet had been soaked since dawn, and in the half-second between the flame touching kindling and the world going white, something ancient, something that had waited 400 years in the scorched ground beneath that very square for a mind broken open wide enough to hold it, poured itself into her like a river finally finding the sea. She did not scream. She changed. And when the smoke cleared, the kingdom that killed her would spend the rest of its short, arrogant existence wishing it hadn't. The kingdom of Valethorn had not burned anyone in living memory, which was precisely why the crowd came in such numbers. Novelty draws people the way blood draws flies. Elenna heard them before she saw them, a low, restless hum pressing against the walls of the palace dungeon, hungry for a spectacle they would later pretend to regret. She had been the royal apothecary's apprentice since she was 12. Taken in after her parents died of the same wasting fever, she'd spent her whole life learning to cure in other people. She knew which root eased a child's cough and which flower in the wrong dose could stop a heart. That knowledge was supposed to make her valuable. Instead, it made her convenient. 3 nights ago, the Queen Mother had collapsed after her evening tonic, the same tonic Elenna had prepared every night for 2 years without incident. By morning, the physicians whispered poison. By noon, the Chancellor's guards were at the apothecary's door. By nightfall, Elenna was in chains, and nobody in the castle, not one soul who had smiled at her in the corridors for 7 years, spoke a single word in her defense. Nobody except Prince Corwin, and even he had only managed to strangled, she wouldn't, before his father silenced him with a look that ended arguments before they began. They needed someone, Elenna murmured to the stone wall of her cell, the words tasting like the truth they were. And I was standing closest to the queen when she fell. That was the whole trial. That was the whole of the evidence against her, proximity, dressed up as guilt because guilt needed a face and fear needed a villain more than the kingdom needed an actual investigation. The old jailer, a widower named Bram who'd once let her tend his gout for free, slid a cup of water through the bars without meeting her eyes. "Girl," he said, voice cracking, "if you know a prayer, now's the time." "I know herbs, Bram, not gods." She managed something almost like a smile. "Perhaps that was always my mistake. I trusted what I could prove instead of what people wanted to believe." He had no answer for that. Nobody ever does when the truth is inconvenient and the lie is comforting. They came for her at dawn. The walk from the dungeon to the execution square took 4 minutes. Elenna would remember afterward that it was the longest 4 minutes of either of her lives. Every window along the route held a face. Servants she'd shared bread with. Nobles whose children she'd nursed through pox. A blacksmith whose burned hand she'd saved from rot with 3 weeks of careful dressing. All of them looked at her now the way you look at a stray dog rumored to carry plague. Pity wrapped around the edges of relief that it wasn't them. This is what fear does, she thought, and some part of her, the healer's part, the part that still catalogued lessons even while walking to her own death, filed the thought away like a bitter herb worth remembering. Fear doesn't need truth. It only needs somewhere to point. The square itself had been a place of executions once, centuries past, before Valethorn's kinder era began. Old stone, older still than the palace above it, worn smooth by feet that had stood exactly where hers now stood. She didn't know that yet. She didn't know that the ground beneath the pyre had swallowed something once. An order of scholars burned 400 years ago for daring to write down truths no king wanted written. She didn't know the ash of that old fire had never truly finished burning. She only knew the crowd's noise dimmed to a strange, thick silence as they bound her wrists to the post, and that somewhere in the front row, Lady Isel Marrow was smiling. It was such a small thing, a smile half hidden behind a lace fan, that Elenna almost missed it. Almost. But healers learn to read faces the way scholars read books, and what she read on Isel's face in that instant was not grief for a poisoned queen. It was satisfaction. She knows something, Elenna thought, and the thought arrived with the cold clarity of ice water down her spine. She knows exactly what happened to the Queen Mother, and she is watching to make sure I burn for it. The executioner lifted the torch. Prince Corwin, 3 rows back, took one step forward and was stopped by his father's hand on his shoulder, a small motion, almost gentle, entirely final. Elenna closed her eyes, not in surrender, in focus. If these were her last seconds, she refused to spend them afraid. She would spend them understanding, turning Isel's smile over and over like a puzzle box searching for the seam. The torch touched the kindling, and the world did not go dark. It went white and vast and full of voices that had been waiting 400 years to speak. The fire that should have taken her did not roar, it listened. Elenna would later struggle to describe what happened in that instant to anyone who asked, mostly because no one ever quite believed the answer, and partly because human language was built for smaller things. It was not pain. It was not even truly fire. It was pressure, an enormous, ancient weight pouring into the empty spaces of her mind the way water fills a cracked jar, finding every corner, every hollow, until there was no part of her left untouched. 400 years, something said, though said wasn't quite right either. It was less a voice than a certainty arriving fully formed, the way you simply know your own name. 400 years, we have waited beneath this stone for a mind willing to burn for a truth it did not tell. She understood in fragments too large for her small human skull to hold all at once that long before Valethorn's current dynasty. An order of scholars called the Ashbound had lived and studied in tunnels beneath this very square. Physicians, historians, alchemists, who recorded the kingdom's true history, instead of the version its rulers preferred. A king 4 centuries dead had burned them all for it, their entire library, their entire lives' work right here on this ground. But knowledge does not die simply because the people who carried it do. It waits. It roots itself into ash and stone and time, and it waits for someone standing exactly where the Ashbound once stood, someone about to be destroyed for a truth as unjust as their own, to open wide enough to receive it. Elenna Duskmere, bound to a stake for a crime she did not commit, was exactly that someone. When the crowd's screaming finally cut back into her awareness, she realized 2 things almost simultaneously. First, the ropes at her wrists had burned through and she was still standing untouched. In the center of a fire that should have already claimed her, because a sudden violent downpour had swept the square in the same heartbeat the flame-caught dousing kindling that had never fully dried in the first place. The crowd was shrieking about omens. The executioner had dropped his torch and was backing away like the fire itself had grown teeth. Second, she knew things now, impossible things. She knew the exact compound that had made the Queen Mother collapse, not poison at all in the way anyone assumed, but a rare imported flower called nightglass lily, which mimicked the symptoms of poisoning in someone already weakened by age, and which grew in exactly one greenhouse in the entire capital, the private conservatory of House Marrow. She knew, with the strange layered certainty of someone who had just inherited 4 centuries of accumulated forbidden scholarship, that Isel Marrow's smile in the crowd had not been cruelty for its own sake. It had been the smile of someone watching a plan complete itself exactly as designed. They didn't just want me dead, Elenna realized, standing soaked and smoking and alive in the wreckage of her own execution. They wanted the Queen Mother's collapse blamed on someone who couldn't defend herself. I wasn't the target, I was the cover. The rain had turned the square to chaos, guards shouting contradictory orders, nobles scrambling for shelter, the crowd surging backward from the girl who would not burn. In that chaos, a hooded figure reached her side before anyone else could, moving with the calm of someone who had planned for exactly this moment. "Not here," the stranger said, low and urgent, gripping her scorched wrist. "Whatever just happened to you, it will not save you from a second attempt, and there will be a second attempt within the hour. Walk. Now, look at no one." Elenna's every instinct screamed to resist a stranger's hand in the middle of the worst night of her life. But some new, deeper instinct, one that felt older than her own 19 years, one that came bundled with the ash and the fire and the voices, told her this hand, at least, could be trusted. "Who are you?" She managed, as they slipped through a side gate the guards hadn't yet thought to block. The hood turned toward her just enough to reveal a single gray eye and the ghost of a grim smile. "Someone who has been waiting a very long time for the Ashbound to choose a new voice," the stranger said. "My name is Thistlewood, and you, Elenna Duskmere, are about to become the most dangerous woman this kingdom has ever produced if you survive the next 48 hours. Behind them the bells began to ring again, not 41 this time, an alarm. Thistlewood's hideout was nothing more than an abandoned tannery on the river's poorer bank, but to Elenna, half-drowned and still smoking faintly at the edges of her execution dress, it felt like the safest room in the world. He gave her dry clothes, a crust of bread, and more valuable than either silence, long enough for her to stop shaking. "You're Ashbound," she said finally, once her voice remembered how to work. "The order they burned 400 years ago, you're still alive." Not alive, Thistlewood corrected gently. Descended. My grandmother's grandmother was 12 when the order burned, hidden in these same tunnels by a scholar who chose a child's survival over his own. Since then my family has done exactly one thing, waited for the ash beneath that square to find its next vessel. Every generation we watched the executions. Every generation nothing happened until tonight. Why me? Because you were innocent and about to burn for it in the exact spot where the last 400 innocents burned. His gray eye studied her with something between pity and reverence. The ashbound magic doesn't choose the powerful, Elenna, it chooses the wronged. It is not a gift. It is a debt the world owes you, paid in knowledge instead of justice. She flexed her fingers still faintly warm and found herself recalling, effortlessly the way you recall your own childhood home, the precise chemical signature of nightglass lily. The layout of House Marrow's private conservatory, 3 different antidotes for its symptoms, and more disturbingly an entire hidden history of the current royal family that no court record would ever admit to. This is what 4 centuries of forbidden knowledge feels like, she thought. Not power. Wait. The Queen Mother, she said slowly. She's still alive. Barely. Physicians are baffled. She improves then relapses, improves then relapses because someone keeps reintroducing the compound in small doses, likely through whoever's been trusted to nurse her since your arrest. Thistlewood's mouth thinned. Which means whoever framed you isn't finished. They need her weak enough to justify a change in succession but not yet dead enough to trigger a full investigation. Isel Marrow, the name left Elenna's mouth like a verdict. Her family's conservatory, her smile in that crowd. She's been dosing the Queen Mother from the start and let me hang for it. Can you prove it? Elenna almost laughed, a short, exhausted, disbelieving sound. An hour ago I couldn't prove I wasn't a witch. Now you're asking whether I can prove a noble poisoner 4 centuries in the making got caught by an inherited memory. But even as she said it, the healer in her, the part of her that had always needed evidence before belief, was already assembling the shape of a plan. Knowledge without a strategy was just a burden. She had spent her whole short life gathering the first. It was time to build the second. I need 3 things, she said, surprising herself with how steady her voice had become. I need access to that conservatory without anyone connecting me to it. I need someone inside the palace who still trusts me enough to carry information without asking why. And I need everyone, including the prince who let his father hold him back while I burned, to believe I am dead, for exactly as long as it takes to make Isel Marrow's confidence her own undoing. Thistlewood studied her for a long moment, and something in his weathered face shifted, the wary caution of a man meeting a legend giving way slowly to something closer to hope. The Ashbound Order believed knowledge was only dangerous in the hands of people who wanted to hide it, he said. You want to use it to reveal something instead. That's the first choice in 400 years that's made this waiting worth it. Don't celebrate yet, Elenna said, pulling the borrowed cloak tighter around her shoulders as thunder rolled outside the tannery's cracked windows. Isel Marrow believes she just watched her problem burn to ash. I intend to let her keep believing that for exactly as long as it benefits me and not 1 hour longer. Outside, the rain had not stopped, somewhere across the river in the warm gold light of the palace. A prince who had not slept in 3 days sat beside an empty execution order. He could not bring himself to file as complete, staring at a scorch mark on the square below his window, and wondering against every instinct trained into him since birth. Whether the omens the crowd whispered about might have been something else entirely. Prince Corwin Valethorn had been raised to believe that a crown required a still face above all else, that a ruler who let grief or doubt show was a ruler inviting his own overthrow. He had worn that still face through his mother's decline, through the accusations against a girl he'd known, since they were both children hiding from tutors in the palace kitchens. And through the walk to the execution square, where he had managed exactly 1 broken word of protest before his father's hand closed on his shoulder like a verdict of its own. He had not worn it well since. 3 days after the execution that hadn't quite happened, because no body had been recovered from the ash, because the storm had been too sudden, too convenient. Too strange for a court that prided itself on rational order, Corwin stood in his mother's sick room watching physicians argue in low voices about a recovery that made no medical sense. Better 1 hour, worse the next. He had asked more than once whether anyone had thought to test the tonics being administered now that Elenna could no longer be blamed for whatever came next. Nobody had an answer that satisfied him. Lady Isel Marrow, who had appointed herself the Queen Mother's constant companion in the days since the trial, assured him with practiced sweetness that everything possible was being done. You've been remarkably present, Lady Marrow, Corwin said, watching her smooth his mother's blankets with hands that never once shook. For someone who barely knew my mother before all this, grief brings people together in strange ways, my prince. Her smile did not reach eyes that Corwin, for the first time in his life, found himself genuinely studying instead of simply accepting. Someone had to step forward after the tragedy of losing her trusted apothecary. Tragedy. The word sat wrong in his stomach, the way a familiar meal sits wrong when you learn afterward it was spoiled. He had used that word himself in the days since the execution, and every time it felt more like something he'd been handed to say than something he actually believed. He excused himself before his expression could betray more than his voice already had, and walked the corridor toward the one place in the palace he had avoided since the fire. The old apothecary workroom, still locked, still smelling faintly of dried chamomile and the particular ink Elenna used for her herb ledgers. He was not supposed to have the key. He'd had it copied 2 years ago, on a night that had nothing to do with poison or trials, back when the worst thing between them had been an argument over whether foxglove was ever safe in small doses. The ledgers were still there, organized in her careful, slanting hand. He read through months of them by candlelight, every dose, every patient, every ingredient sourced and dated, searching for anything that might explain how a girl this meticulous could possibly have poisoned anyone by accident, let alone on purpose. What he found instead, buried in a margin note from 6 weeks earlier, made his blood run cold. Lady I.M. requested private consultation regarding delicate stomach remedies for an elderly relation. Recommended against nightglass lily extract for anyone already weakened. She seemed displeased with the recommendation. Corwin sat with that single line for a long time, the candle burning low, the rain still ticking against the window glass from a storm that had not fully broken in 3 days. Elenna had warned Isel Marrow away from the exact substance now suspected in his mother's collapse, weeks before the accusation, weeks before the execution, in her own hand, in a ledger no one had thought to examine because no one had wanted to look past the easiest answer. We didn't investigate, he thought, and the realization arrived with the particular cruelty of truths that come too late to matter. We burned a scapegoat because a scapegoat was faster than a trial. And I let it happen because standing still was easier than standing against my father. Somewhere beneath the palace, in tunnels older than the throne itself, a hooded man was teaching a girl who was supposed to be dead how to move through her own kingdom unseen. Somewhere in a sick room 2 floors above Corwin's candlelit discovery, Lady Isel Marrow smiled at a queen she was slowly, patiently killing. And somewhere in Corwin's chest, for the first time since the fire, something other than grief began to burn, something that felt uncomfortably, dangerously close to purpose. He closed the ledger. He did not yet know that the girl whose death he was mourning was, at that very moment 3 streets away, learning to read the layout of House Marrow's private conservatory as easily as she once read her own herb charts. He only knew that he was done standing still. The Marrow Conservatory sat behind 3 walls, 2 guards, and a reputation for hosting the rarest flowers in the capital. A reputation Lady Isel cultivated as carefully as the plants themselves, because a woman known for beauty is rarely suspected of anything uglier than vanity. Elenna had walked past those walls 100 times as a girl running errands for the royal apothecary. She had never once wondered what grew behind them. Now, 3 nights after her own execution, she stood in the shadow of that wall wearing a servant's plain gray dress, and a face that 400 years of accumulated Ashbound scholarship had taught her to arrange into perfect, forgettable neutrality. Thistlewood had argued against this, too soon, too risky, let the kingdom settle before testing what she'd become. Elenna had listened to every argument and done exactly what she'd planned to do anyway, because a queen was dying 1 careful dose at a time, and patience was a luxury only the safe could afford. "You're going to get yourself actually killed this time," Thistlewood had muttered, handing her the tools she'd need. "The Ashbound magic saved you once, it doesn't promise a second miracle." "I'm not relying on magic," Elenna had told him. "I'm relying on the fact that nobody expects a dead woman to be more careful than a living one." The guards at House Marrow's servant gate were easy enough. Elenna's inherited knowledge included 3 centuries of forgotten household protocols, enough to produce a forged supply requisition that named her as a hired conservatory hand sent to treat a blight nobody would think to verify. She was inside within minutes, moving through humid glass corridors thick with the perfume of flowers bred for beauty rather than honesty. She found the nightglass lilies in a locked inner room, behind a door that gave way to a hairpin and 11 seconds of patient work. The plants themselves were unremarkable, pale, silvery, faintly luminous in low light, except for the careful ledger beside them, written in Isel's own elegant hand, tracking exact doses and dates that matched, with sickening precision, every one of the Queen Mother's relapses. She's not hiding this from herself, Elenna realized, scanning the pages. She's proud of it. She's kept a record the way I keep patient records, because somewhere underneath the cruelty she still thinks of this as a kind of medicine, just aimed at a different outcome than healing. There was a second name in the margins, one that made Elenna's borrowed centuries of knowledge go suddenly, sharply cold. Chancellor O.M. approves timeline. Full transfer of authority within the season once the old woman's death can be attributed to natural decline. Isel wasn't acting alone. Her father, Grand Chancellor Oswin Marrow, was not merely aware of the plot. He was directing its timeline, engineering a slow collapse of the crown's authority that would leave his own family positioned to fill the vacuum the moment the Queen Mother finally succumbed. Elenna's execution had never been about justice at all. It had been a controlled variable in someone else's careful equation, and she had very nearly been the price of its success. She was still copying the ledger's key pages onto a scrap of parchment when she heard footsteps in the outer corridor. Unhurried, confident, the walk of someone who had never once had reason to fear being caught in her own home. Elenna had less than 4 seconds to decide between hiding and confrontation. The ashbound knowledge in her skull offered no clean answer, because the order had never burned for having good instincts under pressure, only for telling truths too early. She would have to supply the instinct herself. She stepped fully into the candlelight instead of shrinking from it, ledger page still in hand, and let Lady Isel Marrow walk directly into the sight of a dead woman standing very much alive in the middle of her secret garden. Isel's candle did not so much as flicker. Her composure was, Elenna had to admit even in that frozen instant, genuinely impressive. "Well," Isel said softly, closing the door behind her with a click that sounded in the sudden silence very much like a lock. "I did wonder what that storm was really about." For a long moment, neither of them moved. Elenna's mind, layered now with 4 centuries of forbidden strategy alongside her own 19 years of careful, watchful survival, ran through every version of this conversation that might end with her walking out of this room alive. Isel's composed stillness suggested she was doing the exact same calculation and enjoying it far more than she should have. "You should be Ash," Isel said finally, tilting her head with the mild curiosity of someone examining an unexpected specimen rather than a threat. "I watched you burn." "The whole square watched you burn. The whole square watched a storm put out a fire before it could finish its work," Elenna corrected. "What they believe happened and what actually happened have never been the same thing in this kingdom. You of all people should understand that better than anyone. You've spent months making sure of it." Something flickered behind Isel's composure, not fear, not yet, but the faint, unsettled recognition of someone realizing the person across from her knew more than she should. "I don't know what you imagine you found in my conservatory tonight. A ledger with your handwriting tracking every dose of nightglass lily you've fed the Queen Mother for 6 weeks, Elenna said, holding up the copied page. "And a note in the margin naming your father as the architect of a timeline that ends with House Marrow inheriting the throne once she's dead of what everyone will call natural causes. I don't imagine things, Lady Marrow, I read them. I've always been better at reading than believing." The silence that followed had weight to it, the particular density of a moment where a mask either holds or shatters. For a heartbeat, Elenna thought Isel might simply call for the guards and end this the ordinary way. Instead, something far more interesting happened. Isel laughed, soft, genuine, almost relieved, as though a great tiring performance had finally been allowed to stop. "Do you know what it is to be a second daughter in a house that only counts sons?" Isel asked, setting her candle down with deliberate care. "My father has 3 heirs he actually values, and none of them are me. The only thing I was ever given was an education in patience and poison, and I was told to be grateful for it, because at least it meant he noticed me at all. When he finally handed me a real task, weaken the crown, clear the succession, make House Marrow indispensable, I did not hesitate. Can you imagine what that felt like, to finally matter? You nearly let an innocent girl burn to make yourself matter to a man who sees you as a tool," Elenna said quietly. "That's not mattering, Isel. That's being used exactly as thoroughly as I was. The only difference between us is that I never got to choose it and you did, and some part of you still calls that a victory." For just a moment, something genuinely uncertain crossed Isel's face, the particular vulnerability of hearing a truth you have spent years successfully avoiding, spoken aloud by someone with nothing left to lose. Then it was gone, replaced by the same cool composure as before, because uncertainty, Elenna understood now with the full weight of 400 years of watching kingdoms devour their own people, is rarely allowed to survive long in anyone raised to believe love is conditional on usefulness. "A lovely speech," Isel said, reaching with unhurried, elegant menace for the bell rope beside the door. But you're still standing in my private conservatory holding evidence of a crime, and I am still the daughter of the Chancellor of Valethorn. Whatever you think you know, no one will believe a dead witch over a living noblewoman. They didn't need to believe me the first time, Elenna said, already moving, already 3 steps ahead in a way that felt less like planning and more like memory. The accumulated instinct of 4 centuries who had learned, the hardest way, exactly how power silences inconvenient truths. This time, I didn't come here for you to believe me at all. She threw the copied ledger page directly into the candle flame between them, and in the same instant, a second identical copy prepared hours earlier by Thistlewood exactly for this possibility was already crossing the palace grounds in the hands of the one person in Valethorn who had spent 3 sleepless days searching for precisely this kind of proof. Iselle's hand froze on the bell rope as she understood a half-second too late. That she had just confirmed everything out loud to a room she'd assumed was private, and that some part of her in this exact conservatory had just stopped being the only one who knew the whole truth. Corwin had not slept properly in 4 nights. And he told himself that was why his hands shook when Thistlewood's messenger, a boy no older than 10 paid in bread and trusted, because children go unnoticed where adults do not, pressed a folded scrap of parchment into his palm outside the sickroom door. He unfolded it expecting nothing more than another useless rumor. What he found instead was Iselle Marrow's own handwriting, copied in a hand he didn't recognize, listing 6 weeks of doses against 6 weeks of his mother's decline with a precision that made the ledger in Elenna's old workroom look almost gentle by comparison. At the bottom, a single line in different ink, hurried, clearly added afterward. She warned Lady Marrow away from this exact substance before any of it began. Ask yourself why that warning was buried instead of believed. Corwin read the note 4 times before the shape of what it meant fully assembled itself in his chest. Not shock, not quite, because some smaller, quieter part of him had been assembling this same shape since the night he'd found Elenna's margin note by candlelight. Confirmation, when it finally arrives, rarely announces itself as loudly as the doubt that preceded it. It simply settles, cold and certain, into a space that had been waiting for it. He did not go to his father. His father had already proven, at the execution, exactly how he weighed convenience against truth. Instead, Corwin went to the one person in the palace whose loyalty had never once been transactional. Bram, the old jailer whose gout Elenna had treated for free, and who had slipped water through prison bars to a condemned girl because some part of him had never believed the story everyone else accepted so easily. I need to know if anyone's seen her, Corwin said, low, urgent, in the jailer's cramped quarters near the dungeon gate. Alive. I need to know if she's alive, Bram, because if she is, and I don't find her before the Marrows do, everything she survived that fire for will have been for nothing. Bram studied the prince for a long, weighing moment, the same kind of look Elenna herself might have given, the look of someone deciding whether trust was worth the risk of being wrong about it. There's talk, he said finally, down by the tanneries. Talk of a storm that doused a fire it had no business dousing, and a woman in a gray servant's dress moving through the city like she knows exactly where every guard patrol turns before the guards do. Take me there. If I'm wrong about you, my prince, I'll have handed a dead girl's last chance directly to the family that killed her. If you're wrong about me, Corwin said, then I deserve exactly what happens next. But I am done being someone who stands still while my father decides what's convenient to believe. I let that happen once already. I watched her walk to that stake, and I told myself there was nothing I could do, and that was a lie, Bram. There was always something I could do. I simply chose not to pay the cost of doing it. Something in the old jailer's face softened, not trust exactly, not yet, but the particular respect reserved for someone finally saying the hard, true thing instead of the easy, comfortable one. Then you'd best not make that mistake twice, Bram said, reaching for his cloak. Because from what I hear, she isn't waiting for anyone's permission to finish what that fire started. They left through the servants' passage rather than the main gate, 2 men whose absence would be noticed by morning. Walking toward a tannery on the river's poorer bank, where a girl the kingdom had declared dead was at that very moment standing over a copied ledger, with Thistlewood, calculating exactly how many hours remained before Iselle Marrow realized her conservatory had already betrayed her. Behind them in the sickroom, the Queen Mother's fever broke for the first time in 6 weeks, not because anyone had changed her treatment, but because Iselle Marrow, rattled by a conversation she could not stop replaying, had missed her evening dose for the first time since the plot began. It was a small thing. It was also, in its own quiet way, the first true sign that the tide had already started turning. Grand Chancellor Oswin Marrow had built his entire career on a single, unshakable principle: patience wins where force merely delays. He had watched 3 kings rise and 2 of them fall, had learned exactly how long a kingdom could tolerate a slow, deniable decline before it finally cracked, and had positioned House Marrow, generation by careful generation, to be standing in the gap when it did. His daughter's task had been simple by his standards, subtle enough to avoid suspicion, slow enough to look like nature, and if a scapegoat happened to be convenient along the way, so much the better. Convenience, in his experience, was simply patience wearing a faster face. He had not expected the scapegoat to survive her own execution. He had expected even less that she would somehow, within days, be standing in his own study at midnight, having walked past 2 guards and a locked door with the same unhurried confidence he prided himself on in his own dealings. "You're supposed to be dead," Oswin said, setting down his pen with the studied calm of a man who had negotiated with kings and refused to be rattled by ghosts. "So your daughter informed me in her conservatory 3 nights ago," Elenna said, closing the study door behind her. "I've found people in this kingdom are remarkably slow to update their assumptions once a convenient story has already been told to them. It's rather the point of a convenient story, I suppose. You have no proof that would survive a real hearing. A copied page in an unknown hand, a dead witch's word against a chancellor's. I don't need proof that survives a hearing," Elenna said. "I need proof that survives a rumor, and rumors, Chancellor, don't require the same standard as courts. They only require enough people whispering the same uncomfortable question at the same time. Why did the Queen Mother's health improve the very week her most attentive companion happened to be distracted? She let that settle before continuing. Your daughter missed a dose 3 nights ago. The Queen Mother's fever broke within hours. Physicians talk, Chancellor, servants talk faster. By tomorrow evening, half the court will be asking a question you've spent 6 weeks making sure no one thought to ask." Oswin's composure did not crack exactly, but something in the set of his jaw tightened. The recognition of an opponent who had learned somewhere to fight with the same patient, deniable precision he had spent his entire life perfecting. "You've learned quickly for a girl who was, by all accounts, an apothecary's apprentice a week ago. I inherited something older than either of us, Chancellor, in the fire your allies lit to be rid of me. Call it knowledge the crown has spent centuries trying to keep buried. I find it fitting that the same fire meant to silence me instead handed me exactly what I needed to make sure people like you can never rely on convenient silence again." Elenna stepped closer, unafraid, her voice steady with the particular calm of someone who has already survived the worst thing a person can survive. "You built your entire strategy on the assumption that truth moves slower than power. I am here to inform you that assumption just expired. And what do you imagine happens now?" Oswin's voice sharpened, the first genuine crack of anger beneath decades of practiced restraint. "You walk out of my study and the entire kingdom simply believes an executed witch over a chancellor who has served 3 kings. "No," Elenna said. "I walk out of your study, and tomorrow, Prince Corwin, who has spent 4 days assembling exactly the evidence your daughter's own ledger provided, walks into his father's court with proof that doesn't require anyone to believe a ghost at all. It only requires them to read your daughter's handwriting and ask why a chancellor's family kept such careful records of a poisoning they insist never happened." She turned toward the door, then paused, one hand on the handle, delivering the final blow with the quiet precision of someone who had learned, in ash and fire, exactly how much damage a truth could do when it finally found its moment. "You spent your whole career learning that patience wins where force fails, Chancellor. I'd advise you to remember before tomorrow's court session that the same principle applies to the people you thought you'd silenced for good." She left him standing in his study, the candle guttering low, the first true tremor of fear he had felt in decades settling into a man who had spent his entire life believing himself untouchable. Outside in the corridor, Prince Corwin was waiting exactly where they'd agreed, his face pale, his eyes fixed on the girl he'd mourned for 4 days, standing very much alive in front of him for the first time since the fire. "You should have told me you were planning this," he said, voice rough. "You should have told your father the truth 4 days ago instead of letting his hand on your shoulder decide for you," Elenna answered, and there was no cruelty in it, only exhaustion, and something that might, given time, become forgiveness. "We're both a little late to the parts of this we should have done sooner, Corwin. Let's not waste what's left of tonight arguing about who was later." The Court of Valethorn had not convened for an unscheduled session in over a decade, which meant every noble family in the capital found some reason to attend when word spread, quietly and quickly, that Prince Corwin intended to present evidence regarding the Queen Mother's illness. Few of them knew what to expect. Fewer still expected the doors to open on a girl the entire kingdom had watched burn 6 days earlier, walking into the throne room with her chin level and her hands, for the first time since her arrest, entirely unbound. The gasp that swept the hall was audible enough that King Farron himself half rose from his throne before catching himself, his composure snapping back into place a beat too late to hide the shock beneath it. Lady Isel Marrow, seated beside her father in the family's customary place near the front, went the particular shade of pale that comes not from surprise, but from the sudden sickening certainty that a carefully built structure has just begun to collapse. "This woman was executed," King Farron said, his voice carrying the brittle authority of a man trying to reassert control over a room that had already stopped fully believing in it. "Explain to me how a ghost walks into my court. I did not die, Your Majesty. Though I understand why the story of my death was easier for this court to accept than the truth of my innocence." Elenna said, her voice steady, in a way that owed as much to 4 centuries of inherited resolve as to her own hard-won courage. "I am not here to argue that a storm and a miracle saved me, though both played their part. I am here because the fire that should have killed me instead left me holding proof of exactly who poisoned your mother, and exactly why an innocent apprentice was made to answer for it instead." What followed was not a dramatic confession wrung from a villain, because real justice, Elenna had come to understand in her handful of days walking through this kingdom as someone the world believed dead, rarely arrives with theatrical flourish. It arrived instead in careful, patient pieces, Corwin presenting the ledger pages recovered from his mother's own physicians, who confirmed the symptoms matched Nightglass lily exposure precisely, a greenhouse keeper from House Marrow's own staff quietly located and questioned by Thistlewood's network in the preceding 2 days. Confirming deliveries of the flower timed exactly to the Queen Mother's relapses, and finally unavoidably Isel Marrow's own handwriting compared by the court's own scribes against documents she had personally signed in the preceding year matching beyond any reasonable dispute. Grand Chancellor Oswin Marrow, given the chance to speak in his daughter's defense, chose instead the same cold calculation that had guided his entire career, distancing himself with careful, deniable language, suggesting his daughter had acted alone, out of some misguided personal ambition he claimed no knowledge of. It was, Elenna thought, watching Isel's face crumple not from guilt, but from the particular betrayal of a father abandoning her exactly as she'd always feared he would. Perhaps the cruelest evidence of the entire hearing, proof that Isel had spent her whole life being used by a man who discarded her the instant she stopped being useful precisely, as she'd confessed in her own conservatory days before. "You built this entire scheme to matter to a man who was never going to value you beyond what you could provide him," Elenna said quietly, not as an accusation but almost strangely as something closer to grief. "I understand what it is to be discarded by people who should have protected you, Lady Marrow. I do not forgive what you allowed to happen to me. But I recognize, better than anyone in this room, that you were also a tool in someone else's hands long before you ever became a danger in your own." The court's judgment, when it finally came, split the Marrow family's fate along exactly that fracture. Grand Chancellor Oswin Marrow stripped of his title and estates for orchestrating a conspiracy against the crown exiled beyond Valethorn's borders before the week's end. Lady Isel Marrow, sentenced not to the fire her own schemes had nearly cost an innocent woman, but to a lifetime's exile in the northern abbeys where King Farron noted. With the first genuine humility Elenna had ever seen him show, she would have the rest of her days to reckon with what ambition unmoored from anyone who valued her for herself had cost everyone around her, including in the end herself, and Elenna Duskmere, apothecary's apprentice condemned witch. Inheritor of 400 years of forbidden knowledge, stood in the center of a throne room that had tried to burn her alive 6 days earlier, and listened to King Farron Valethorn offer in front of his entire court. The first formal apology any Valethorn monarch had given in the kingdom's recorded history. She did not feel triumphant, exactly. She felt mostly tired, the particular exhaustion of someone who has spent days proving a truth that should never have needed proving in the first place. "What now, Ashbound heir?" Thistlewood murmured beside her as the court began slowly to disperse into 100 different urgent conversations. "You've won, the truth is out, the guilty are punished, most stories end exactly here." Elenna looked past him, toward the window where the ash-gray stones of the execution square were visible in the distance, and toward Corwin, watching her from across the room with an expression that suggested he too understood their story wasn't quite finished yet. "Most stories end when the truth wins," she said softly. "I intend to make sure this kingdom remembers why the truth almost didn't. They rebuilt the execution square within the month, though rebuilt was, Elenna thought, too gentle a word for what actually happened. King Farron In the raw and uncomfortable honesty that seemed to have taken root in him since the hearing ordered the old stones removed entirely. The same stones that had held 400 years of the Ashbound Order's ashes. The same stones that had nearly held her own, and replaced with a modest garden open to any citizen of Valethorn who wished to walk through it. At its center, a simple plaque bore no king's name and no grand declaration, only a single line Elenna herself had chosen. Let this ground never again mistake fear for justice. She had considered, in the weeks after the hearing, exactly what to do with the inheritance the fire had given her. 4 centuries of forbidden knowledge, medicine and history, and truths that generations of kings had preferred buried rather than examined. Thistlewood had expected her to guard it as carefully as his own family once had, waiting in shadow for the next injustice worth answering. Instead, Elenna did something the old Ashbound scholars, burned for daring to simply write things down, would likely have found almost unbearably fitting. She opened it. Not all at once and not recklessly, she understood better than most exactly how dangerous truth could be in careless hands. But she began with Corwin's quiet and increasingly steady support, and with King Farron's grudging but genuine permission. To establish something Valethorn had never had in its recorded history. An open archive staffed by scholars rather than courtiers, where the kingdom's actual history, its failures as plainly recorded as its triumphs, could be read by anyone willing to look. She named it without any particular ceremony, the Ashbound Archive, and made certain its first shelf held nothing more dramatic than the recovered notes of the scholars burned 4 centuries before her, finally returned to daylight after 400 years of silence. You could have used what you carry to rule this kingdom outright, Corwin told her one evening, months later, as they walked together through the new garden where a stake had once stood. Half the court already treats you like something closer to a queen than an apothecary's apprentice. You'd have had their support. I don't want a crown, Corwin, Elenna said, and meant it, in the way only someone who had nearly died for other people's convenience could mean it. I watched what happens when power decides a single life is an acceptable price for its own comfort. I have no interest in becoming someone capable of making that same decision about somebody else, no matter how good my reasons might feel in the moment. I would rather be the person who makes sure no court ever finds it that easy again. And I sell, he asked quietly. It was a question he'd asked before gently, and one Elenna had never quite finished answering. I sent word to the Abbey last month, she admitted. Not forgiveness exactly. I don't think either of us is ready for that word yet, and perhaps we never will be. But an offer, if she wants it, to write down her own account of everything her father built her to become, for the archive, not for a court. I think there's a version of her, somewhere underneath everything she was raised to believe mattered, that might actually want to be understood instead of simply used. Whether she takes that chance is hers to decide. I've learned this year more than any other, that the only justice worth trusting is the kind that leaves room for people to become something other than what they were forced into. Corwin said nothing for a long moment, simply walking beside her in the quiet evening light, and Elenna found she no longer needed him to fill every silence with reassurance the way the old, frightened part of her once had. She had walked to a stake believing the entire kingdom had already decided who she was. She had returned from the ash knowing, with a certainty 4 centuries deep, that no crowd's fear and no chancellor's ambition got to make that decision for her ever again. The bell that had once tolled 41 times for her execution rang differently now. Not a countdown to an ending, but the ordinary unremarkable sound of an evening, closing gently into night over a kingdom that had finally learned at considerable and unnecessary cost. The difference between a comfortable lie and an inconvenient truth. Elenna Duskmere had been sentenced to die for a crime she never committed. She had returned instead with knowledge 4 centuries in the making, a kingdom's darkest secret exposed to daylight, and a quiet, unshakable resolve that would outlast every crown that came after hers. Some fires, it turned out, were never meant to end a story. Some were only ever meant to begin one.